Okay, thanks, Pete. Howdy, everybody. Like Pete said, if you have any questions, don't be shy. Go ahead and type those in as you think of them. I like to go ahead and address things while it's still fresh on your mind and it's not any interruption at all. It's usually helpful to the whole audience. So, with the time that we have today, I want to talk about a few things equipment related with your sprayers. Talk about some things we need to do as the season winds up this year before we put that equipment in the barn. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about what we're going to do next spring before we take that equipment back out to the field. How to set it up properly, how to check that it's functioning like it should so that you can make sure that equipment is operating efficient and effective, and also operating in a manner where we can reduce potential risk for spray drift. So this is what we're going to cover today. I want to start with spray system cleanout. While this isn't directly related to sprayer setup, you really can't set up a sprayer until you clean it out properly. We got to make sure we're starting with a blank slate. And then we'll move on to some of the preseason checks and tests that you need to perform before you start using that sprayer again. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about spray nozzles, because this is a really cheap and effective way to not only make sure your pesticides are being put out in a uniform and proper manner, but also reduce spray drift, which is something that a lot of us really need to bear in mind, especially where your operation has some interface with other properties, maybe some sensitive vegetation, things like that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about nozzle spacing and boom height and how those two things are interrelated. And then we're going to wrap up just briefly talking about sprayer calibration. So I want to start on sprayer cleanout. Certainly at the end of the season, before you put that equipment away, and not only that, but in between applications, anytime you're using that sprayer, you need to be doing all you can to make sure that you're cleaning that out properly, for a variety of reasons. Number one, if you have a spray rig that's being used in multiple crops, so say maybe you spray a garden with an insecticide today, then you're moving it over to a pasture tomorrow to spray some weeds and back and forth. That could be a big problem if you leave some of that pasture herbicide in the tank and you didn't clean it out right. So for multi-use spray equipment, we want to eliminate that residue in the system. The other thing is quite a few of the active ingredients in the products that we use in range and pasture can be corrosive, especially if they're left in the system overnight or over a week or so. That solution is just sitting there and causing some problems within your pump, your fittings, valves, things like that. And so we want to make sure we're getting that material out of there so you can keep your equipment running properly as long as you can. So the best thing you can do when it comes to clean out is to do it right after you come out of the field. As soon as you're done spraying, start to clean out. The longer that solution sits up in the tank and sits in the boom and the lines, the more residue you're going to have to deal with coming back out of that system, because that solution starts to work its way into cracks and little nooks and crannies in the spray system. The other thing you can do is check the label on the products that you've used. A lot of the herbicides we use today will have a procedure on the label specific to that product for cleaning it out of a tank. Because depending on the formulation and the chemistry of that product, the clean out isn't the same for all products. So check the label. Not all products will have a clean out procedure there, but quite a few do. And then make sure you're being thorough. It's not good enough anymore to just run water through the sprayer and call it good. We really need to be pulling some of the components out of that system, like the nozzles and screens. If you have end caps on your boom, go ahead and open those up and flush water through them. Then worn hoses can be another major problem area. Worn hoses tend to trap a lot of residue, and we'll talk more on that here in a little bit. So I pulled a little excerpt off of the Grazon Next label, fairly common product that a lot of us use in pastures. And on that product label, they do give you a pretty specific cleanout procedure. And so you can see there in bold, they've highlighted, we don't really recommend that you use equipment where you've applied Grazon Next to then go into very sensitive crops like tomato, tobacco, soybean, things like that. Then further down, they list that actual procedure. So in the case of Grazon Next, that means rinsing and flushing the system right after you've finished up your application, and then dispose of that rinse water properly. One of the best ways to get rid of your rinse water is to go out and spray it back into that field that you just sprayed. Then for the second rinse, you add in a quart of ammonia for every 25 gallons of water, circulate that through the system, and then let it sit up overnight if possible. And then come back the next day, flush that out, rinse it twice again with clean water, and then finally take your nozzles and your screens out and scrub those separately. And so if you're doing all of that immediately after you've sprayed, chances are you're not going to have much, if any, residue left in that sprayer. That's a very thorough cleanout process. If you go over and look at the Roundup WeatherMAX label, Roundup, that's a pretty water-soluble product. So the good news is when it's soluble like that, it's not terribly difficult to clean out a sprayer. So on that label, they don't have a long, drawn-out cleanout process spelled out for you there. They just say clean things promptly after use by thoroughly flushing with water. Other products, quite a few of other products, are not that easy to clean out, but Roundup fortunately is. There are products out there still today that don't have any kind of specific cleanout process on the label. If that's the case, my go-to would be a triple rinse, and that you use a commercial tank cleaner somewhere in that process. So typically we're going to, as soon as we're done with application, drain the system, refill it with water. You don't have to fill all the way up, but maybe 10 to 25% of your tank volume. Fill that back up with clean water, and then flush that through the boom. Turn on your recirculate, so you're flushing back through that recirculate line as well. Then go ahead and drain that, and then in your second rinse, then you can use a tank cleaner. And so a lot of your co-ops and ag chemical supply places will have these tank cleaners. We use one called Wipeout quite a bit down here. Nutrisol's another one. There's a lot of products out there that'll work for a tank cleaner. And those do a good job of freeing up some of the more oil-like herbicides that we use, as well as the water-soluble products. And they help clean up some of the solid residues that can come from dry-type herbicides. So I like to use the tank cleaner in the second rinse. Go ahead and run that through the system. And then after that, remove the nozzles, screens, check valves, things like that, and pull them out and put them in a bucket where you can scrub them. Make sure you're wearing gloves when you're doing that. But then I like to place them in a bucket and just use an old toothbrush to scrub those. And then finally, you make 1/3 final rinse just with clean water through the system. Run it through the boom, run it through your recirculate line, and then go ahead and drain it. And then you're done. It sounds like a lot of work, but if you ever make the mistake of leaving some of these products in the tank and dealing with the aftermath of that, it doesn't sound that bad. It's a little bit of work that saves you a lot of trouble. I see here we have a question. Is there anything wrong with using RV antifreeze after you clean the tank to help prevent corrosion? No, not a problem. We've used antifreeze in the past. Sometimes we'll use diesel to winterize a sprayer. Either one will work. I like diesel in a roller pump. It helps kind of lubricate that roller pump over the winter. One thing I would say, if you're using diesel, I know some folks that have made this mistake where they use their ATV sprayers for fire suppression. When you come out of the winter, make sure that diesel's out of the tank before you use them for fire duty. We've seen some problems there. You get a big surprise when you spray a little diesel on a brush fire. But antifreeze, that wouldn't be any issue. If you're using diesel, I like to use ag diesel so it's dyed and you can see that it's diesel and not water in the tank. But either one will work for winterizing your sprayer. So here I've got a photo from one of the old 3-point rigs that we use here for a lot of maintenance work at the station, just to give you a idea of what a typical plumbing system is going to look like. And so here you can see the suction lines coming off the bottom of the tanks, and then before those lines get to the pump, we have a screen or a strainer there. And then as we come out of the pump and go to the boom, there's a second strainer. A lot of the rigs that you'll buy at Wiley and Northern Tool will have these strainers already in place. That's there to protect the pump and then protect debris that may come loose inside the pump from getting to the boom. So both of those strainers need to come off during the cleanout process. Again, please wear gloves when you do that, because those strainers, or that strainer body, does hold a fair amount of solution in there. You don't want to get that on your hands. And then out on the boom itself, on each nozzle, we typically will place the screens that you see there on the right hand side, little mesh screens with check valves in them on each nozzle. And I do recommend that you use those. It helps stop some of the dribbling when you shut the boom off. Those also need to come out. So when you pull the nozzles, go ahead and dig those screens out as well, and place those into a bucket and scrub them well. Once all those are scrubbed, you can rinse them with clean water, reinstall them back in the boom, and you're set. A few things to consider. If you haven't done a good job of cleaning out a spray system, one thing we found is that in prior applications, anything that contains surfactants, crop oils, fertilizers, herbicides that have pre-mixed surfactants, like the name brand Roundups, they are very effective at acting as a tank cleaner. We run into this in row crops all the time where, let's say, a sprayer was being used to spray some weeds in corn today. They didn't clean out the sprayer very well. The next day they load it with Roundup and go spray cotton, and that Roundup, acting as kind of a soap with its surfactant that's mixed in, frees up residue from the prior herbicides that were used and introduces them back into the spray solution, and we end up with crop injury. So again, spray system clean out is well worth your time. You don't want to run into these issues where a month later, all of a sudden, some high surfactant load tank mix that you put out causes you problems because it's bringing back out some of that residue. Some of the dry formulations tend to settle out. So these are the WDG formulations or wettable powders or granulars that you mix them into your water and get them into solution. They're that way because the active ingredient isn't very water soluble, so they place it onto some clay particles, and that's what you're actually putting in the tank. If there's not constant agitation in that system, those dry formulations like to settle out, and they'll tend to form a lining on the inside of your tank and your hoses, and over time that can be a real problem because you've got this clay lining that then starts to absorb residues from other herbicides. So the best thing you can do there with those dry formulations is, again, clean out as quickly as you can after you've run that sprayer, because as soon as you stop running your agitation or your return line, those are going to start to settle out. And then if you're using dry formulations, definitely would recommend a commercial tank cleaner. They do a good job at removing some of those residues that start to stick on the inside of your hoses. And then always think about what the sprayer was last used for, what you put in it the last time, what products were used. Think about what you're using it for moving forward, and make sure it was cleaned out properly before you do so that you don't run into any issues there. So now, assuming that we have a well cleaned out spray system, we come back out in the spring, it's getting to be time to start spraying some weeds. We need to do some system checks. We need to go ahead and fill that system up with clean water, turn on your pumps, bring it up to pressure, check all of your fittings, all the plumbing, make sure there's no leaks there. Check your hoses. Hoses get neglected a lot. We tend not to replace hoses until they leak, when in fact we need to be replacing those quite a bit earlier. And I've used an example off of that sprayer that I showed you earlier. So this is one of those do as I say, not as I do moments, because you can see these old dry rotted hoses on our spray rig there. If they're that rough a shape on the outside, chances are they're pretty rough on the inside as well. And that's especially true for those of you that have folding booms like this one. Those sections of hoses that are used around where the boom actually folds and articulates tends to wear that hose out quite a bit sooner because it's getting flexed constantly. So chances are there's tears and cracks inside of those old hoses I've shown you there. And those are all opportunities or hiding places for herbicide residue to hang out even after you've gone through the cleanout procedure. So hoses are cheap. If they look suspect, go ahead and replace them. Then it's always a good idea to go ahead and pull all the nozzles out of the boom and read the numbers off of those and make sure you have matching nozzles in there. What happens a lot of times when you have a nozzle get plugged up, you go to reach for a new one and say, okay, there was blue nozzles in the boom, I'm just going to grab another blue nozzle and throw it in there. Well, that blue nozzle might be a different model, it might be a different type. So you want to make sure you have matching nozzles in the boom. And if you can't read the numbers on the nozzles, that means they're too old. Just go ahead and throw them out and start fresh. Then you want to do a visual check of the patterns of the spray quality and also check nozzle output. We'll talk about both of those here in a second. And just keep in mind that nozzles do in fact wear out. So I've got a fresh out of the box flat fan nozzle here right next to one that's pulled out of our sprayer that had about, I think, 2 seasons of use on it at this point. And you can see that stainless steel insert in the middle of the nozzle. It does wear and corrode over time, and that's what's taking place here. So not only is that metal starting to corrode, but the most important part of the nozzle, which is this opening or orifice, is starting to erode. So materials coming through it are actually wearing that metal down, and so the output of that nozzle is not what it once was. It's going to be quite a bit higher. So that causes problems with your calibration. And then the opening of that orifice is starting to become kind of ragged, and so that's going to impact the quality of the spray. It's not going to be as even as it once was. If you take a closer look at those nozzle openings or orifice, here you can see with A, you've got a fresh, clean nozzle. The orifice is the shape and size that it should be from the manufacturer. As you go over to B, this is where we start to see some erosion taking place. So maybe a season or two worth of use, and the output of that nozzle is now higher than it should be because that orifice is bigger than it was. And you get over to C, you can see the irregularities on the edges of that opening, and that's where we really run into problems with spray quality. Because if you look at the pattern of a nozzle as worn as that, you're going to see streaks. So we have too much spray going to one side, not enough on the other, in addition to the output being a little higher than it used to be. So we don't want to let them get to that point. We want to keep them fresh and clean. Nozzles are cheap. One thing that drives me a little crazy sometimes is folks will go out and buy a nice new expensive sprayer, and when they get it home, they'll go pull the old nozzles out of their old sprayer and put them back in that new system. When you look at nozzles, you're talking $4 to $10 a piece. They're pretty cheap. And that's really where the rubber meets the road when you're applying a pesticide. So go ahead and replace them anytime they seem suspect. And the way we do that is in the spring, before you go to the field with it, check the output of each nozzle. So after you've made sure all your nozzles match, then you want to get a pitcher out. And while that system is spraying just clean water, go in and collect the output of each nozzle. So you might take a stopwatch and collect 10 seconds worth of spray from each of your nozzles, and then measure that out, and then look at those outputs and see if there's any that seem a little off. And if any one of those is off by more than 10%, go ahead and replace it. And if you have multiple nozzles off along the boom, probably a good idea to go ahead and replace them all as a set. Because as you're well aware, the products that we're using these days are not cheap. Nozzles are cheap. So you don't want to run into a situation where you're putting out more than you think you are, because that's going to be costing you quite a bit of money in the long run. Going back to uniformity or spray quality, this is what we like to see over here. Nice uniform deposition of the product all along the boom. As that boom, or as those nozzles start to wear, like we talked about, then we start to run into these problems where we have streaking, because we've got a worn edge on that nozzle orifice up here, and it's causing us some problems where we get uneven output of our spray solution. And one way you can check for this is to spray, again, clean water only. We don't want to put any pesticide in at this point, but spray with the light kind of behind you, and look at that spray coming out of the boom, coming out of the individual nozzles. A lot of times you can see those streaks if that's beginning to take place. Another method is what we're looking at here, and that is to run that sprayer, again with just clean water, but run it over some dry pavement. Asphalt in this case, or concrete. Sometimes dry caliche, you can do this. But go ahead and run that sprayer over that dry pavement, and then look back at the area that you've sprayed and look for streaks. Because in this case, I can see a very clearly defined streak right here where my arrow is, and it looks like it's just below that nozzle third in from the left. So that may tell us that one's a little worn. Something's going on there. We're not getting enough material right there in the middle of that spray pattern. Probably a good idea to replace that nozzle. So we're going to talk quite a bit about nozzle types and why that's important, but before we get there, I want to make sure we're on the same page when it comes to figuring out nozzle designations, because this can be a little confusing. It's a pretty standard process across the industry. What I tend to use are T-Jet products, just because they're a little more available down here, but their numbering system is fairly uniform with other manufacturers. So here we're looking at two different nozzle designations here. We have an XR 11002 and then a DG 8004E. So what's that mean? What's the difference here between these two? Usually those first letters tell you the nozzle model. So in the case of these T-Jets, an XR is an extended range. That's kind of a standard old flat fan nozzle. A DG is what they call a drift guard nozzle. It's more of a low drift nozzle. It makes bigger droplets, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So that tells you the nozzle type, or the nozzle model. Then those next numbers, so the 110 or the 80, that tells you the spray angle. So the width or the angle of that spray pattern, 110 degrees or 80 degrees. For most broadcast type nozzles, flat fan nozzles, you're looking at somewhere between 60 and 125. Most of them will fall between that. But 80 and 110 are some of the more common ones out there. Then those last numbers, the 02 or the 04, that tells you the flow rating. So an 02 flows 0.2 of a gallon per minute when it's run at 40 psi, and that's assuming it's a brand new, fresh out of the box nozzle. An 04 would run 0.4 of a gallon. If you saw a nozzle that had a 10 at the end, that would be 1 gallon per minute at 40 psi. And then what about the E on that drift guard nozzle? We won't run into these a lot outside of row crop, because those E nozzles, that stands for an even spray pattern. We typically only use those in row crops where we're wanting to spray a product just over the planted row and not along the whole boom. So for range and pasture use, which I'm assuming that's most of the folks on the webinar today, if you see an even nozzle in your boom, throw it out, because you don't get the right overlap between nozzles if you're using that. Those E nozzles, they look just like a standard flat fan nozzle from the outside, but the spray pattern is very, very different. So a lot of times nozzles will get mixed up, or you reach into a bucket and grab a few, and you end up with one of these even nozzles from who knows where. I know it's happened to me. make sure you're checking to see if those banding nozzles or even nozzles are anywhere in your boom. Get rid of them unless that's your goal. But again, outside of row crop use, I really can't think of any other reason we'd be using them. Now, when it comes to drift management, one of the most effective things we can do is just to pick the right nozzle design. Like I said, nozzles are cheap. This is a cheap and effective way to reduce your risk for drift. It's not just nozzle design though. You know, nozzle size, operating pressure, drift retardants, those things can also impact droplet size. But nozzle design is one we're going to focus on quite a bit. The reason we're concerned about droplet size is that smaller droplets tend to take longer to reach the ground, so they stay airborne for an extended period of time. All the while, they could be moving sideways if the wind's blowing. So we like large droplets for most situations. So to increase droplet size, we can drop our pressure. We can go up a size with our nozzle, so we might go from an 02 to an 03. There's drift retardants, which are products that you actually pour into the tank that change the viscosity of the spray and give you larger droplets. But the one we're really going to focus on is just choosing the right nozzle from the beginning, the right design. And one thing you do have to weigh as you're making that decision is also the products that you're using. So for contact herbicides, and the only one I can think of that we might use in a pasture situation would be Gramoxone. That's a herbicide that does not translocate, or it doesn't move inside the plant. It's not systemic. Any herbicide like that, coverage is very, very critical. And typically we get better coverage with smaller droplets. So for Gramoxone, that's kind of an isolated case where you might actually want a finer spray, knowing full well that is a little more prone to drift. But for most of the products we use in range and pasture, these are systemic herbicides. And so they actually get into the plant, they get into the vascular system of the plant, and they move. They might move to the roots or move up to new growth, but the main point is that they will move. And so coverage isn't that critical. So we can use some of these low drift nozzles that we'll talk about here in a minute with a lot of our range and pasture products that we use for brush control and for weed control. And then that last one for pre-emerge herbicides, and the only one I can think of that we might be using would be Prowl H2O, which we use sometimes for sandburr control. For pre-emerge herbicides, coverage is really not something we worry about because we're really treating the soil. And we're going to then later on wait for a rain to wash that material in. So coverage isn't an issue. We can use low drift nozzles in that case. So a few years back, we did some work to actually measure droplet size and tie that back to drift. And we're going to be talking about 5 different nozzle types, and these are all pretty widely available. We used all the same sizes, so these were all T-Jet 110 degree 02 size tips. Starting with a simple flat fan, which was the T-Jet XR. We've already talked about it. Then we had the drift guard, which has a little more complicated design that tends to give you a larger droplet. We used one called the air induction XR. The big change there is that these air induction nozzles actually have ports on the side that draw air into the spray, and that causes some agitation inside the nozzle and tends to give us larger droplets. And then the T-Jet AI, and finally the T-Jet TTI, or Turbo T-Jet Induction. So 5 very different nozzle types that we were running at the same pressure, under the same conditions in a wind tunnel to actually measure the size of the droplets. So let me set this up for you. There's a lot of info here, but hopefully we can get through this. It's fairly easy to understand. So on the bottom, the x-axis, we have those 5 nozzle types that we just talked about. So an XR flat fan, drift guard, air induction XR, the old T-Jet air induction, and then the TTI. And then those blue bars show you the average droplet size. And we measure that in microns. And so to give you some idea of that size, or for scale here, diameter of a human hair tends to run about 100 microns in diameter. And so if you look at the XR, we're getting a droplet on average that's about 175 microns, so not much bigger than a human hair. And that's what we consider to be fairly driftable. And as you go through these different nozzle designs and look at the size of droplet they make, you can see it varies widely. You get over to this TTI nozzle, and now we're looking at droplets that are nearly 700 microns, so much, much larger. And keep in mind, these are all flowing the same amount of spray solution, running at the same pressure. The only difference is droplet size. Now the main take-home message here is that red line, and that shows you the fraction of that spray, or the percent of that spray, that we consider to be highly driftable. Okay, these are the very, very fine droplets. And those old XR nozzles tend to make a lot of fine droplets. And if you've ever used them, you've seen that mist that comes off of the spray. And so in this case, nearly 18% of that spray was coming out in that very, very fine category. And so while for a contact herbicide, this might be okay because we need it to get good efficacy, when we have the option of using large droplet nozzles, like with a lot of our range and pasture products, I really wouldn't recommend using an XR because we don't need that level of coverage, and we definitely don't need this amount of risk for drift. Those fine droplets can move a long, long ways, as we'll see here in a second. So you might think about changing over to some of these air induction nozzles, low drift nozzles. I'm focusing on TJet products here, but you can go to Greenleaf, you can go to Hypro, any of these companies, and they all make some of these low drift type nozzles. So you go over here to this TTI nozzle. In this case, 1/3 of 1% of that spray was coming out in that very, very small or fine category. So 1/3 of a percent versus 18%. That's a big, big difference when it comes to drift. Another way to look at this is by using water sensitive paper. So this is yellow paper that we spray water solution over the top, and everywhere a droplet impacts that, it leaves a little red drop, or a little red spot. And so with the XR flat fan, like we've said several times now, we get good coverage. You can see we're getting excellent coverage across this paper, but you see a lot of very, very small droplets. Those are very driftable. Those are a little dangerous. But as you go up to some of these low drift nozzles, you can see what a difference that makes. Big droplets, and more importantly, fewer of the fine droplets. So that's a drift guard. This is the old standard air induction nozzle. And then this is a Greenleaf manufactured tip called a Turbo Drop. Very similar. Big droplets, and the most important part is fewer of the fine droplets. Another way to look at this is with this field demo we did back in 2014. Basically, we took separate spray rigs, we lined them up on the edge of a soybean field, and every one of those rigs had a different spray nozzle type in it. Okay, we loaded all of those rigs with the same spray solution. In this case, it was dicamba, was the herbicide we were using. And then while the wind was blowing the spray into the soybeans at about 7-8 miles an hour, we turned all of those rigs on at the same time, sprayed for 10 seconds, and then shut them off. So everything is identical with the exception of the nozzle type in the spray rig. So we could actually come back in after this and look at that drift across the field. So I'll give you two of the biggest, or I guess the extremes here. This is that TJet TTI nozzle that we talked about briefly a second ago. So a very large droplet nozzle. In this case, I came back a few weeks afterwards and I walked out into these soybeans. And soybeans are very, very, very sensitive to dicamba. So it's very easy to see where the drift stopped. I walked out into this field and started making some measurements on how far it moved. If I remember right, it was about 175 feet. So 7 mile an hour crosswind, moved it 175 feet. When you use the old flat fans that we see in the bottom right, this is the one that really floored me, because under the same conditions, I walked all the way out the end of that soybean field, which was 522 feet, and I was still detecting soybean injury out there, and actually soybean injury in a neighboring cotton field as well. So 175 feet versus 522 feet, plus quite a bit. That's the difference, having just the right nozzle in the sprayer. And this is just a chart giving you those numbers. So XR nozzle, like I said, drifted very, very far, actually extends further than what I'm showing here. And then with these low drift nozzles, so that's the TTI, here's a green leaf, what they call a TDXL, and then a High Pro ULD over on the right hand side. All three of those are very, very good low drift nozzles. And as you can see here, this makes a big difference. When it comes to setting your pressure, we're going to kind of come out of the nozzle talk here for a little bit. So when it comes to setting your pressure, anytime you get a set of nozzles, you need to check the manufacturer's website or ask for some materials wherever you buy your nozzles, because the manufacturers typically will have little cards that they can give you that show you the recommended operating pressure range for your size and type of nozzle. So let's say for the ones that you've bought, the pressure range is 30 to 90 psi. Okay, that tells us the high and the low, but where do you actually need to be? Well, there's not a hard and fast rule there. What I like to do is go ahead and set my equipment up to run kind of mid-range in that range of pressures that they give you. That way, as the season progresses, you have some room to adjust up or down if need be, without getting outside of that recommended range. But bear in mind, higher pressures do give you smaller droplets, which might give you better coverage, but then you run into issues with drift. Going with the low end of the pressure range, that's going to give you larger droplets. Sometimes if you get too low, though, spray coverage starts to suffer. Your spray patterns aren't what they should be. But certainly more of a low drift scenario there. But typically I like to be right in the middle of that pressure range that the manufacturer gives you. So this shows you just what pressure will do by itself. This is water sensitive paper again, where we have a flat fan running at 25 psi on the top, and then on the bottom we doubled it and went to 50. And you can see better coverage, but along with that comes more fine spray droplets, okay, driftable droplets. So pressure alone is one way you can manipulate things, as far as minimizing drift. Another thing we can do is think about the angle of your spray nozzles. Think about your spacing along the boom, because as you manipulate those, you can then sometimes get your boom down lower and lower to the ground. And the lower the boom is, typically the less risk we have for drift. So here you're looking at just spray angle. Here's a 120 degree spray angle versus an 80. If you can, I'd like to get the 120 degree. There's some 125s out there too, because that wider spray angle allows you to get the boom down lower, closer to the ground, while still maintaining nice overlap between tips. If you have an 80 degree tip, you have to raise that boom up a little bit, because typically we like to have about 30% overlap between nozzles. It's not an exact science. There's a little bit of eyeball work here, but about 30% is where we need to be. When nozzles are too close to each other along the boom, or your boom is too high, you can run into some issues where you have an overdose. You have too much overlap. So we're getting too high of a rate right here between nozzles. Or on the other side of that, if your nozzle tips are too far apart, or your boom is too low, you can actually end up with an underdose or even skips. So you might completely miss a weed right here because it just didn't get sprayed. So again, about 30% overlap, but that's going to that's going to be dictated by a lot of things: boom height, your spray angle, and the nozzle spacing along the boom. So do everything you can to get the boom as low as possible, but you want to keep that correct overlap. And this table right here is very, very handy, because this shows you the boom height in inches over here for either a 20-inch spacing between nozzles or a 30-inch spacing, and that changes based on the spray angle of your nozzles. So let's say this would be my ideal scenario, where I have 110-degree spray nozzles and I'm using a 20-inch spacing between my nozzles. That means our optimum boom height is going to be about 10 to 12 inches above the target. That's very, very low. And in that scenario, if you can run your boom that low, there's well, I wouldn't say very little, but much less risk for drift to occur, because that boom is so low, the droplets are getting down on the plants very quickly. Now, if you change those nozzles and you go to an 80-degree nozzle, now we have to raise that boom up 17 to 19 inches. And if you have your nozzles on a 30-inch spacing, then that compounds the problem. You have to get that boom up even higher. So I like the 20-inch spacing. I know it means buying more nozzles on a given length of boom, but it does allow you to get that boom down as low as possible. And then you combine that with using a wide-angle spray tip. You're really setting yourself up pretty well to avoid some drift issues. So to visualize this, we go back to the soybean study. We had another demonstration that we piggybacked onto that, and that's where we actually took two of those booms with the same nozzles, but we did them at different boom heights. So on the left-hand side, that's where we held the boom 24 inches above the soybeans. On the right-hand side, we doubled that and we went to 48 inches. And you can see the difference in these photos, and I can tell you the difference in the numbers, actually measuring the distance of that drift. Doubling our boom height, in this case, doubled the distance that we drifted herbicide. So boom height is very, very important, along with droplet size. Last thing I want to talk about, and this will be fairly brief, but it's calibration. And we could talk for another hour just on calibration, and I'd probably put all y'all to sleep if I haven't already, but I do want to reinforce the point. Calibration is one of those, you can do everything else right, but if you don't calibrate, or you don't calibrate correctly, nothing else matters. So you could have the most perfectly operating sprayer coming out of the spring, but if you never calibrated, who knows what you're actually applying. You can measure out in precise quantities all of your products, but we still have no idea how much is actually coming out per area until you calibrate. And so I don't know what happened in this photo, but I have to imagine that this was some kind of calibration or mixing error. So you have a product here that might have been safe on that turf grass when it's put out at a labeled rate, but because they went out at too high of a rate, probably because they weren't calibrated, now we have this nightmare on our hands. And that happens a lot. You know, our herbicides, let's say for range and pasture use, most of them are fairly safe on grasses, and that's certainly true when they're used at a labeled rate. But if you go out with a very, very high rate, if you're not calibrated correctly, you can really damage some of our grasses, both native and improved. So be very, very thorough in your calibration process. Another point here are these charts that I mentioned earlier that you can get from the manufacturer for your nozzles. These are very, very, very useful because they tell you things like droplet size and approximately what the flow rating is for these nozzles. But they'll also show you in these tables what your gallon per acre output might be at different speeds and at different pressures. And a lot of folks will just set their sprayer based on those charts alone and think that they've calibrated. These are a good starting point, certainly, for getting your sprayer dialed in before you really start calibrating, but you can't rely on those charts themselves to calibrate your rig, because depending on where your pressure gauge is in the system, depending on how you've plumbed your boom, the suction line, and the line going from the pump to the boom, your pressure might be quite a bit different at the nozzle than what your gauge is telling you. And then the other thing is that these charts, that assumes you're using a brand new in-spec nozzle. And typically we're using nozzles that have a little bit of use on them. And even from the factory, I've found nozzles that don't quite put out what they should. And so in a perfect world, these charts would be great, but in reality, these are just a starting point and nothing more. You need to do a full calibration, and that means doing some measuring of the output of the sprayer and doing a little bit of math. And so I'm not going to go through all of the different methods. There's quite a few options for calibrating a sprayer, but I'll give you some resources here. First being, if you have a smartphone, whether it's Apple or Android, doesn't matter, there are apps out there where you can plug in your application speed, your nozzle output, the spacing between your nozzles, and it will tell you what your spray rig is giving you on a per acre basis. So those can be handy. One that I've listed here that I kind of like more than some of the other options is called Calibrate My Sprayer. Clemson University produces that one. I know it's there on Android. I'm pretty sure it's there on Apple. But it's free. There's a lot of other apps out there. Give them a try. The other way to do it is by doing a little bit of math. It's not that involved. But there's guides available at the websites I have listed here that can walk you through that process. The first one is if you go to publications.tamu.edu, there's one there called Sprayer Calibration for Turfgrass. Just because it says turfgrass doesn't mean it's only for turfgrass. It's applicable to pretty much all equipment. So it's a good, very comprehensive guide. Actually uses the formula that I like to use. If you'll go to forages.tamu.edu/weeds, there's another guide there called Sprayer Calibration. I believe that one uses a little different formula. And then if you go to my website, I won't walk you through that long URL, but I will leave it up here long enough that you can write it down. You can click my weeds section, and there's a short publication there called Boom and Boomless Sprayer Calibration. Uses a little different method. So until you've calibrated a few times and you've gotten comfortable with whatever math or app that you like, you might try some of these different methods and look at different ways to calibrate your sprayer. There's 100 different ways to calibrate a spray rig. Just find the method that works best for you and that you can remember and go with that. The other thing I'd say, we're more focused here on beginning of the season, setting up your spray rig correctly for the year. Definitely do a calibration at that point, and then throughout the season it's a good idea to do calibration checks, because somebody might hit a valve, they might turn a screw on a return line or what have you, and your calibration might change. Okay, so you might do checks periodically throughout the year and make sure that sprayer is putting out what it should. Typically, I've got it down to a fine science because we do a lot of spraying over here at the station. Before any of our sprayers go to the field, they get a calibration check. And 9 times out of 10, they're perfectly calibrated, but every now and then something changed, and we wouldn't have caught it unless we did a calibration check. It just takes a few minutes, and it's a bit of good insurance. So with that, I think we're right at 50 minutes, right where we need to be. I'm going to leave on this slide. I'll leave it up here for y'all to write down these web addresses. Looks like there's a way to email a copy of the slides to all of y'all. Pete put up a link there. With that, does anyone have any questions? Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you, Dr. McGinty. It was really good. I went ahead and on the chat pod, I went ahead and copied and pasted your URL for your website. And let me go ahead and say this while we kind of wait some more questions is I'm gonna go ahead and kick out a survey. Please go ahead and complete the survey. We appreciate it. All the answers are anonymous. So if by some chance the when I kicked out the survey, if your screen gets uh, covered up, just go ahead and click on it on the bottom, and you should be get back to our Adobe Connect. Again, the other thing is our next session will be October the 4th. Nutrition monitoring of range animals, and we have Dr. Doug Tollison doing it, and we're looking forward to that. If you're not following us on Facebook, yeah, you can follow us on Facebook and on facebook.com/txrange. You can search for us on Facebook and you can find us. Yes, sir.
And hey, Pete, folks are asking if I could send them slides, and I'm totally okay with doing that. Is there a way I can get the email address
Yes.
list? I can just send that
Well,
to everybody.
the email addresses I can capture are the ones that are typing them in on the chat pod.
Okay. So I guess if y'all have put your email address in for the CEUs, I can certainly email that to you.
Yeah, because some of them are captioned for CEUs. All we can do is we could look at it the other way. We can type in your email address, and they can contact you direct.
Either way, either way. It's, I'm gonna put mine in here. So folks, I just typed in my email address. If you're not on the list for the CEUs, just drop me a note at that address and I'll send you the slides.
Any other questions?